met recently, but I took the bus and went to the Ministry of Defence and walked in. He said to me, "I want you to be a minister." And I said, "I'm just an ordinary woman. I don't know how to run a ministry." And he replied, "I want you to be the minister for the municipalities. You have to take it on."
In the male-dominated world of Iraqi politics, this was a hugely significant appointment. Dr. Nazir became not just the first female minister in Iraq, but across the whole Arab world. In her 3 years as a minister, Dr. Nazir pioneered slum clearances in Baghdad and created the first large public housing projects, including in what later became Sadr City. Together with fellow female campaigners, she also managed to convince religious leaders and the government to approve a new secular civil law that guaranteed women's rights in marriage and in inheritance. Her nephew says it was amongst her greatest achievements.
She told me she went to Shiite scholars, Sunni scholars. She went in Sinjar, to the Yazidis. She went to Christian monks and this Christian priest to ask them about what they think. And she came up in a very, very good law. It was a law that actually unifies all Iraqis regarding to this sect. And it is regarded as one of the icons actually of progressive movements in Iraq. And it is seen as very progressive as compared to similar laws elsewhere in the countries around us.
Dr. Nazir also wrote extensively about the status of women in Iraq, collating for the first time data and information about their lives. But when the left-wing government was ousted in a coup in 1963, she was forced to go into hiding. 5 years later, after yet another coup, she returned to public service, becoming the chief inspector of hospitals. These were more stable times for the family, and her nephew remembers regular visits to his favourite aunt's home in Baghdad.
She used to give me
power. When dozens of government officials were purged and executed, Dr. Nazir was forced to flee into exile.
She came in one night and she said, "I'm going next week." So I asked her, "Are you coming back?" And she laughed. She said, "We'll see." So we understood that she's not, that she was threatened and she had to leave.
She settled in Berlin, and her nephew Leith didn't see her for another 12 years, until he himself moved to Britain to study. In exile, she continued writing and campaigning for women back in Iraq until she became ill in 2002. She died in Germany in 2007. Her old friend and fellow campaigner Mubajjal Baban also left Iraq when Saddam Hussein took power and settled in the UK. Nazir used to visit her in London, where Mubajjal still lives.
I miss her a lot. I consider her like a big sister. What can I say? I am very saddened because she is gone.
Mubajjal Baban, a friend of the pioneering Iraqi feminist Dr. Nazir al-Dulaimi, was talking to Mike Langin, who also spoke to her nephew, Dr. Leith al-Dulaimi. Finally this week, a figure from the more distant past who has taken his place in the history of the Caribbean. This is centred on a successful slave uprising which sent shockwaves across America and Europe. The rebellion in 1791 led to the creation of the first black republic in the world. As Claire Bowes reports, this is the story of Toussaint Louverture and the birth of Haiti.
I have been a slave, I am willing to own it. But I have never received reproaches from my masters. I have neglected nothing for the welfare of the island. I have robbed myself of rest to contribute to it. I have sacrificed everything for it.
At first glance, Toussaint Louverture was an unlikely revolutionary. He was in his 50s and a freed slave when he first turned against his former masters. But within a few years, he'd found worldwide respect and had even written his country's first constitution.
The colony of which I was commander enjoyed the greatest tranquility. Agriculture and commerce flourished there. The island had attained a degree of splendor which it had never before seen, and all this, I dare to say it, was my work.
He was someone who had a very engaging personality. He was perfectly at home with a wealthy white planter who was born in France, but he could just as easily talk and converse with an African-born slave.
Sudhir Hazara Singh is author of Black Spartacus, the epic life of Toussaint Louverture.
So Toussaint was a man of exceptional ability, remarkable intelligence, had a phenomenal memory, and it was on that basis that he rose to become the coachman and effectively the right-hand man on the plantation where he grew up.
His parents were African-born slaves, but Toussaint had been granted his freedom and worked for a salary on a plantation owned by white French settlers. At the time, Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was one of the most profitable colonies in the world.
It was a place which produced vast quantities of sugar, coffee, cocoa, indigo. It was a place where fabulous fortunes were made by the European settlers who lived there, and it also made huge amounts for the French exchequer.
It was profitable because the work was all done by slaves. 90% of the population were slaves, many first generation, born in Africa and brought across the Atlantic by ship. Letters written home by European visitors show even they were shocked at the treatment of the enslaved people, who at that time were referred to as Negroes.
Negroes die daily in chains and under the lash. They are beaten, strangled, burnt to death without any legal formality.
The white women are even worse than the men. One of them recently gave a formal dinner. When a dish was burnt, she flew into a rage and ordered her Negro cook thrown into the oven in which the fire was still burning.
So this was a truly horrifying system of domination. This included throwing slaves into furnaces, burying them alive, blowing up their bodies with gunpowder, cutting off their limbs. And of course, there was a massive amount of sexual violence against women.
Thousands of kilometres away in France, a new vision of a fairer future was being created in the turmoil of the French Revolution. The slaves of Saint-Domingue hoped they too would be granted the equal rights popularised in France. But they were repeatedly denied them.
They realised that these rights are not going to be handed over to them. They're going to have to fight for them. In the late 1780s, we think, the senior figures among the enslaved population were starting to meet regularly in the north of Saint-Domingue and planning an uprising. And we believe Toussaint took part in these conversations.
The uprising was set for August 1791. It was sanctified at a spiritual ceremony.
Where there was probably a number of different religious rituals, but voodoo rituals certainly played an important part. The revolution gets its blessing, and the insurrection is launched shortly afterwards. It was a very violent insurrection. There are a lot of deaths among the planters.
Hundreds of plantations were burnt to the ground, and Toussaint's rebels gained more and more territory.
The French authorities send some troop reinforcements by the end of 1791.
After 3 years, the French troops finally gave in and declared they would abolish slavery in Saint-Domingue. The slave army had won.
Toussaint then thinks that the French Revolution has chosen the right path in the colonies. So he fixes as his own kind of strategy, maintaining an alliance with the French so that the Black Revolution will be able to develop under the protection of the French authorities. Because, of course, this is still a world in which slavery is regarded as the norm. The Spaniards haven't abolished it. The British haven't abolished it. Nowhere near.
In fact, the British had also come to Saint-Domingue in an attempt to seize control of the profitable colony. And Toussaint had another battle on his hands. This time fighting on behalf of the French Republic to retain control of Saint-Domingue.
the British really go all out to try and capture Saint-Domingue after 1793. They spend £10 million, send in at least 20,000 men, and Toussaint is able to wear them down by a war of attrition. What we would call today psychological warfare, harassing their lines, sending people at the early hours of the morning outside their camps to make a huge amount of noise.
After 5 years, the British gave up. The French made Toussaint deputy governor of the colony. His vision now extended to the whole island of Hispaniola. And in 1801, he successfully invaded the other half, the Spanish-owned colony of Santo Domingo, present-day Dominican Republic, and banned slavery there too.
By the late 1790s, he's created something that is absolutely unprecedented, a political system in which white people, people of mixed race, and black people are able to live with each other in a state of relative harmony and enjoy the same basic civil and political rights.
Meanwhile, in France, Napoleon had come to power and was under pressure to re-establish slavery. In 1802, he sent French troops to Saint-Domingue to restore white rule. Toussaint Louverture was captured and taken to France.
Means have been employed against me which are only used against the greatest criminals. Doubtless, I owe this treatment to my colour, but my colour... Has it hindered me from serving my country with zeal and fidelity? Does the colour of my skin impair my honour and my bravery?
Toussaint Louverture died in prison in April 1803. But the struggle in Saint-Domingue continued, and Napoleon's troops were defeated just months later by the black former slaves who named their new republic Haiti.
Slave owners everywhere came to dread even just the name of Toussaint, but also the name of Haiti, and so Haiti becomes a symbol.
In overthrowing me, only the trunk of the tree of Negro liberty has been cut down. Its branches will shoot up again, for its roots are numerous and deep.
As a military leader, he was someone who established for the first time this extraordinary idea that black people were militarily very gifted people who could take on and defeat European armies.
Sudhir Hazari Singh, the biographer of Toussaint Louverture, was speaking to Claire Bowes. And Toussaint Louverture's story will be added to the Black History collection on our ever-expanding archive on the website. From the history of viruses, very pertinent just now, to the collapse of communism, world wars, women in history, and humans in space. It's all there. Search for BBC Witness History Collections. And we'll be back next week with more. Until then, this is Max Pearson. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This is the BBC Service, where Dr. Mark Carney delivers this year's Wreath Lectures.
In his second lecture, Dr. Carney takes us back to the global financial crash of 2008.
Question of all of us, recognizing that to some extent we are responsible for the society in which we live, and those responsibilities are even greater for those who are at the top.
How far has the financial sector changed? And if there is another crisis, will we be prepared?
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, The Big Idea with David Edmonds.
Love him or loathe him, we can all agree that Donald Trump is not a normal president. Previous presidents would never behave like President Trump. The abnormal is becoming normal. I'll be finding out why this matters.
Business Matters is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 1 o'clock GMT. This is the BBC World Service. I'm Jamie Robertson. It's evening in the US, morning in Asia. At the BBC, we're going to bring those time zones all together with their stories over the next hour in Business Matters. We'll discuss the stumbling talks between the UK and the EU over their future trade relations. The leaders will meet face-to-face in the next few days, trying to pull something from what seems like a wreckage of a negotiation.
In the longer term, the question is then, would the UK really be isolated, especially now with the new US administration, which seems to be reaching out to the European Union?
And with workers staying at home, willingly or unwillingly, we look at the fate of the systems designed to carry them to work. That's on Business Matters, coming up just after the news.
Hello, I'm Justine Green with the BBC News. The governors of two of the biggest US states, California and New York, have warned of a worsening public health crisis as hospitals are taken up by coronavirus patients. The New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, said further restrictions would have to be introduced to prevent the health system being overwhelmed. The California governor, Gavin Newsom, warned that hospitals had continued to fill rapidly to dangerous levels. Sophie Long is in Los Angeles.
Intensive care units reached 85% capacity, triggering regional stay-at-home orders, subjecting millions of Californians to the most restrictive regulations since the statewide shutdown in March. Group gatherings are banned and businesses that had just started to reopen have been told to shut once more. But some local sheriffs say they won't enforce the renewed lockdown. Meanwhile, the country's top infectious disease expert warned the spread of the virus could accelerate further still during the holiday season and into the new year.
US media say President-elect Joe Biden has chosen the retired Army General Lloyd Austin as his defense secretary. If confirmed, General Austin will be the first African-American to lead the Pentagon. Researchers in the United States say there's been a huge increase in civilian casualties in Afghanistan since the US military relaxed its rules of engagement for airstrikes targeting the Taliban in 2017. The cost of war study, based on UN figures, says there was an increase of 330% in the number of civilians killed in airstrikes between the end of Barack Obama's presidency and the last full year of recorded data for the Trump administration. Here's Warren Bull.
The researchers say the increase in aerial bombardment was partly due to having fewer American troops on the ground, but also, they say, appeared to have the aim of putting more pressure on the Taliban to return to the negotiating table. Since the US scaled back its sorties following a peace agreement with the Taliban in February, the Afghan military has multiplied its own airstrikes, killing dozens of its own civilians.
Eritrea has released 28 members of the Jehovah's Witnesses group after they served prison terms of up to 26 years. Here's Will Ross.
A Jehovah's Witness statement said its members were freed from prison in Eritrea after serving sentences of between 5 and 26 years. Some were detained for being conscientious objectors in a country with compulsory military service. The organisation says 24 members are still in prison. President Isaias Afwerki stripped Jehovah's Witnesses of their citizenship in 1994. Eritrea is one of the most oppressive nations in the world, with no elections or parliament and a draft constitution that's never been implemented. Only 3 religious denominations are allowed: Orthodox Christianity, Sunni Islam and the Lutheran Church.
That's our Africa regional editor, Will Ross. World news from the BBC. The United States has added Nigeria to a list of countries for which Washington is especially concerned about threats to religious freedom. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, didn't give the reasons for the decision as he announced it, but a State Department report earlier this year pointed to mass detentions of members of a Nigerian Shia group. Israeli ministers have announced a nationwide nighttime curfew starting on Wednesday to try to halt a steep increase in coronavirus cases ahead of one of the main Jewish festivals. The decision was taken by the country's so-called coronavirus cabinet, a group of ministers headed by the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There have been protests in the Lebanese capital Beirut after the head of the central bank said subsidies for some basic goods couldn't continue beyond the next 2 months. Dozens of demonstrators attempted to reach Parliament. Others headed to the government headquarters. Roads were blocked with burning tyres. One of the most pioneering mountaineers of the 20th century, the British climber Doug Scott, has died aged 79. In 1975, he and a partner were the first to ascend Everest by the southwest face, an experience they only just survived after spending the night at a higher altitude than anyone had ever done before. John Donnison has more.
On the way back down, they got into trouble. As night fell and with temperatures around minus 50 Celsius, the pair had to make an improvised bivouac, sheltering in a snow cave. Their oxygen and fuel supplies exhausted, they had to stop themselves from falling asleep for fear of freezing to death. In total, Doug Scott reached the summit of 40 of the world's highest peaks, almost all completed in so-called alpine style, without the use of oxygen and carrying his own kit. In later life, he founded the charity Community Action Nepal, a country close to his heart.
John Donnison there, ending the BBC News.
Hello, welcome to Business Matters. I'm Jamie Robertson. On the programme today, the Brexit negotiations over the UK's future trading relations with its biggest and closest neighbour, the European Union. We'll look at what's at stake. And the UK gets the first of the Pfizer vaccines in what the head of the country's National Health Service calls a decisive turning point in the battle against coronavirus. Is the public ready for a jab?
I'm terrified of injections, so I don't want to have it, actually.
I think it's wonderful, and I think people should take it.
Well, I've been joined throughout the programme by two guests on opposite sides of the world. Peter Morisi, who's a Professor Emeritus of International Business at the R.H. Smith School of Business in the University of Maryland, and he's in Washington. Peter, hello, good evening. How are you?
Good evening, I'm very fine, thank you.
Good. Nice to have you on the programme again. And also the financial professional Jessica Kine in Malaysia, southern Malaysia, in Nusa Jaya. Nice to have you on the programme.
Lovely, Jamie. Nice to be back, thank you.
Good, Jessica. Right, well, let us start in the UK, actually. The UK and European leaders are to meet face-to-face as early as Wednesday in an effort to save trade talks between the two that have all but collapsed. In the last few hours, the two sides issued a joint statement. It said, "We agreed that the conditions for finalising an agreement are not there due to the remaining significant differences on three critical issues: level playing field, governance and fisheries." Here's Ireland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, on the state of the negotiations.
If anything, new problems are being landed on the table rather than solutions. And that's been really unhelpful, not just on the new proposals around pelagic stocks, but on other issues as well, in terms of investment and ownership within the British fishing industry. So I think, there is a great deal of frustration on the EU side, not just within the EU negotiating team, Michel Barnier's team, but also across member states. Many of the ministers I spoke to today are just getting increasingly frustrated and increasingly resigned to the fact that there may be no deal possible this week.
That's Ireland's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, EU leaders are meeting on Thursday. Had been hoped an agreement would have been in place for them by then. The UK, although it left the EU at the start of this year, has been in so-called transition, still within the EU single market and its customs union, and subject to EU rules. That transition period does end on December the 31st. I asked Carsten Brzeski, who is Chief Economist ING in Frankfurt, what had gone wrong with negotiations.
It seems to be still about fish and fishery. This is politically extremely important for both the UK and at least France when it comes to Europe. At the same time, economically, this sector is not really important for the total economy, but this is still where they cannot kind of close the open ends. The other one is, I think, even more important, the level playing field. So this is really about how to deal with each other once the Brexit is really ongoing. So this is a big issue. And then I think we have the political issue, and the political issue is about trust, is about previous agreements. Will the UK really stick to previous agreements? And this is why I think what the Union has always said, there is no deal until we have a deal on everything. And this is why we're actually more or less at the same level at which we were, at least at the start of the year.
Financially or economically, what's at stake here?
A lot for the UK and a little bit less for the EU. When you look at the traditional trade relationships, obviously the EU as a trading partner is more important to the UK than vice versa. And this has simply to do with the size when you compare the UK economy to the total European economy. It is also at stake that we are still in the middle of a pandemic, that we see due to these lockdown measures in both the UK and in the EU, that both economies will probably go back into recession at the end of this year, and that then a no-trade deal Brexit would really come with a ill timing, so namely at the moment that the economy should start to recover going into 2021. No one really needs a disruptive no-trade deal Brexit.
So for the UK, how important is this really? I mean, politically, for the government, and socially, economically, in all aspects? Is it going to make a huge change to the whole way that the UK operates?
I think it won't make a huge change to the way the UK is currently operating, because this is not that there is an economy which also has the euro currency, for example, leaving the European Union. So what will complicate the UK's economic life is that all of a sudden there are no common standards, that the EU could more easily close its borders so that all logistics, supply chains when it comes to production are disrupted, interfered, will become more expensive. I think this is what is clearly at stake in the short term. In the longer term, the question is then, would the UK really be isolated, especially now with the new US administration, which seems to be reaching out to the European Union to strengthen again these transatlantic relationships?
Carsten Brzezinski there, talking to me earlier from ING. Peter, because the US was just mentioned at the end there, the relationship between the US and the UK, I mean, there's always been this idea, hasn't there? The US has been close to the UK for the reason that basically we're part of Europe. It's a kind of bridge into Europe, a way of negotiating with Europe. One, is that true? Two, does it change now?
Oh, I think the premise that the UK and America are close because it's a bridge into Europe is not really the foundation of the relationship. It's more that, frankly, the United States, more than by any other nation, was founded by the British, essentially. And we have your legal system and so forth, and Americans feel a kinship to Britain that they don't feel to the continental Europeans. Now,
well, I would dispute that. You feel fairly close to the French. Your Statue of Liberty was built by them. You have, that may not be the best reason, but I mean, it is one pretty good reason. Well, and also the kind of things you're talking about are a long, long time ago, aren't they? Now, it's not really the kind of thing you build modern diplomacy upon.
The legal system is right now. We share the same legal system, for example. We also share the same approach to economics, or managing our economies, managing our banks, and so forth. My feeling is this is a problem for the Americans in the short term, because Mr. Biden feels compelled to not really change America's policy towards Europe, but just put a kinder face on it. The Germans and the French are going to be told they have a GDP 3 to 4 times larger than Russia. They are as populous, they're more populous than Russia, and they should be able to field their own army and defend themselves from the Russians. They don't like that message. They blamed it on Trump being a nationalist. Well, guess what? One of the most sympathetic faces in American politics is going to tell them the same thing, but it's going to be done quietly and politely and behind closed doors. We don't have the kinds of problems with Britain that we do with France. Now, that's not the subject here, but the real critical issue here is that the British will not be able to immediately negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States because Mr. Biden is mending fences and there's the Irish lobby in Congress. These are basically people my age and older who still feel an affinity to the old country, and it really isn't the old country in a lot of ways for them, but it's the old country of their parents or their grandparents.
Okay, I want to bring just 1 second, actually, because I want to bring Jessica in. I mean, I just want to find out if this our little discussion here we're having with Europe, between the UK and Europe, whether it's registering at all in Malaysia, or is it not even a blip on your radar?
I think it's in the press every day, but I think there's less in-depth knowledge about the ins and outs. You know, is it the level playing field problem? Is it the fishing Yeah, is it the fishing thing? Is it the level?
It confuses a lot of us too, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And then why is Britain so fussed about, receiving an affront to its sovereignty? Yes? So there's governance issues, and dispute issues, so that in the future, when there is another spat, how will they settle it? And then there's the very sensitive fishing thing, and to echo Peter's sentiment, the lobby for, the old country, the whole Irish aspect to it as well.
What about trade deals?
The demands that Britain is making are very similar to those that Canada makes towards us. And the deal that Britain wants with Europe is the deal that Canada has with us. Britain's ultimate positions are really quite consistent with what goes on over here in North America. We have not imposed our subsidies regime on Canada. We essentially rely on a modified version of the WTO rules with regard to Canada. It really comes down to that. We've been managing with some considerable difficulty joint fisheries for 150 years with constant tension, but we manage. This is really about Europe imposing itself on its neighbors. For example, the deal that it has with Norway, where Norway contributes, but it to help make the rules.
Peter, I'm going to have to interrupt. We're running up against deadline on news. I've just got to get to the main news headlines, and then we'll come back to you. We've got some other things we've got to chat about. A lot of things to talk about in this programme. Just let's go to Justine Green with the news. Justine.
Thank you very much. Governors of two of the biggest US states have warned of a looming crisis in hospitals as coronavirus cases continue to rise sharply. Media reports say Joe Biden has chosen a retired General, Lloyd Austin, to lead the Pentagon. He'd be the first black defence secretary. Researchers say there's been a big rise in civilian casualties in Afghanistan since the rules of engagement were relaxed for US airstrikes on the Taliban. And one of the most notable mountaineers of the 20th century, Doug Scott, has died aged 79.
Justine, thanks very much indeed. On Tuesday, the UK is going to start vaccinating the most vulnerable members of its population against COVID-19. It's going to be the first country to mass deploy the vaccination made by Pfizer and the German biotechnology partner BioNTech. Now, Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, granted emergency use approval of the vaccine, which they say is 95% effective in preventing illness, and that's just 23 days after Pfizer published the first data from its final stage clinical trial. Here's the Chief Executive of the National Health Service England, Sir Simon Stevens, talking ahead of the start of the rollout.
Tomorrow is the beginning of the biggest vaccination campaign in our history, building on successes from previous campaigns against conditions, diseases like polio and meningitis and tuberculosis. So hospitals and then GPs and pharmacists, as more vaccine becomes available, are going to be vaccinating at least until next spring. So in the meantime, we're going to have to continue to be very careful. But if we do that, I think there's every chance that we will look back on tomorrow as marking a decisive turning point in the battle against coronavirus.
That's Sir Simon Stevens of the National Health Service England. How do people feel about the prospect finally of getting a jab? Here's what a range of people from around the UK told the BBC.
Well, I'm terrified of injections, so I don't want to have it, actually.
I think it's wonderful, and I think people should take it. Especially sort of my age.
I just hope it works, and that's it. Because it's been a dreadful year,
I would be first in the queue, definitely. But my mum's in a care home, and she is just recovering from COVID. And it means that, we're safer. I would definitely have it, yes. We've just got to stop listening to Facebook and start listening to the experts.
The people who have made the vaccine have said that the vaccine is fine, so any manufacturer who says that their product is fine has to be taken with some pinch of salt, I would say. I will not be taking the vaccine, and I would not be allowing my son to the vaccine either.
I'm really excited about it, I feel, that it's good, that I got the opportunity of doing it. And so I'm not nervous or anything like that. I'm looking forward to it.
So voices around the UK talking about the vaccine and the prospect of having it in the rollout, which starts tomorrow. Well, Jessica, is this a turning point? Is this the point at which things suddenly start to get better, do you think?
It has been an important turning point, but I think it has not been accompanied by trepidation across, the global population. Yes, not just Malaysia alone, whatever, in Asia Pac. I think everyone hails the arrival of, for example, the Pfizer-BioNTech or the Moderna development in the States where Peter is. But I think we need to bear in mind the trial periods have been very short, only about a year. And now there are 320 vaccines being developed across, various companies across different countries in the world. So a short trial period. If you're if you're an avid fan of vaccines, perhaps you'll step up. But I think in the general populace, there is much trepidation.
What's that trepidation based on? The fact that, not this vaccine, but I don't know what kind of vaccine is going to end up at my doorstep. I don't know what's going to end up on your doorstep, what's going to be jabbed into your arm or mine. But are you going to be perfectly happy? Are people going to be perfectly happy having somebody coming along and jabbing their arm with a vaccine which has been, not this one necessarily, but any vaccine, but has been sort of rushed out in the way that these ones will be rushed up over the next few months?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think most people know that this virus has already had, I think, between March and May, a Japanese state university, Tohoku University, researched that it mutated 5,000 times between March and May. And they even did a geographical split across various countries in the world. So I know that a lot of the formulas are based on RNA, which is supposed to kind of mutate along with the virus, from what I've read. I'm no medical expert, but I think there's deep concern. Whilst we need to rely on a reliable vaccine, I think it would be churlish to say there's no great concern across, the average populace.
Peter, I'm asking you on a day when Anthony Fauci, the top infectious disease expert in the US, is warning that Christmas is going to be worse than Thanksgiving in terms of spreading of COVID-19. We need it desperately, don't we?
The United States is in very desperate shape when it comes to this virus. It's that simple. However, I would point out to you that now these are polls, and we know about polls. The Pew Trust, which is hardly liberal or conservative or extreme or biased in any way, has found that Americans have become more receptive to vaccines over the last several months than less, and more likely to take it. About 60% now said they would take it, whereas a couple of months ago it was 50%. I don't think we have any choice. The tests went extraordinarily well. I'm disappointed that the Americans aren't rolling it out as fast as Britain is, because they had the same portfolio of data. I spoke to my physician about that the other day. And it shouldn't, I know a little bit about analyzing information. And it shouldn't take a month in circumstances like this to analyze the data when it's presented to them. It isn't like more tests are going to happen. Either we go or don't go. And this is sort of like the D-Day invasion. We have to go. It's that simple. The health of the United States of America is too much at risk not to take this chance.
Okay, Peter, thank you. To Venezuela now. President Nicolás Maduro's party and allies have just won control of the National Assembly in Venezuela's legislative elections. The victory does mean that Mr. Maduro now has total control of the country's political institutions. Mr. Maduro said the election would mark the beginning of an era of recovery for Venezuela, which has been mired in an economic crisis. The opposition boycotted the election. Opposition leader Juan Guaido said that the low turnout showed that the majority of Venezuelans had, quote, turned their backs on Maduro and his fraud. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo described Sunday's poll as a fraud and a sham, and the European Union has also rejected the result. Eileen Gavin is an America analyst with the advisory group Maplecroft.
Maduro probably looks to be in a better position to begin a process potentially of much-needed structural economic reforms and also potentially negotiations with the external community.
but it's been condemned as a illegitimate election by some 16 countries. The US has called it a sham. Is that going to damage his international credibility and his ability to be able to make any meaningful reforms?
Certainly, turnout was quite low at less than 30% or maybe even less than 20%, and that has been a bit of a blow to him. But at the same time, his plan all of this year has been to get control of the assembly with a view to getting himself into a better position. And regardless of whether the external community, the Western allies, acknowledge this or not, he is, the main political actor in Venezuela, and he does have control now of the legislature and everything else. And so any form of negotiations will have to involve him. The previous US strategy of maximum aggression, which was, aiming at ousting Maduro, it was a non-starter to begin with.
So what kind of reforms do you think he's going to try and put into place?
He's already mooted some legal changes to the existing oil frameworks. This would be in support of the state oil company PDVSA, which needs an injection of private money to resuscitate the oil sector. And he would also like to bring in some private foreign investment in other sectors. Now, the question is, given that the lack of external validity for this election, the question is whether foreign investors from, say, Europe or the US would be willing to acknowledge whatever legal reforms he puts in place. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. Other allies, such as Russia and China and other Asian players, might be willing to move forward on the basis of some of the reforms that he will be able to push through under the new Congress.
But if they're trying to get some kind of international acceptance, the last thing they've said, at least former Communications Minister Jorge Rodriguez said that the opposition politicians were going to be jailed after the 5th of January because they are, and I quote, thieves, drug traffickers, traitors to the fatherland. That doesn't sound as though it's going to go down very well elsewhere in the world, let alone with the opposition itself.
This rhetoric is designed to force the hardline opposition into exile, effectively. It is leaving them no choice but to leave the country or face, very, very difficult living conditions. But ultimately, I think, such is the depth of the crisis now in Venezuela, whether you look at it from a political viewpoint, economic, social, and security. We're talking about Venezuela becoming a failed and utterly criminal narco-guerrilla and paramilitary state, and one that's located in a highly strategic position in the Western Hemisphere next to the next big oil producer, Guyana, no less. It's going to require some much bigger thinking around a solution. By that I mean a solution along the lines of the peace talks in Colombia, and potentially drawing on some of the methods used in Northern Ireland or South Africa, for instance.
It was Eileen Gavin from the advisory group Maplecroft. You're listening to Business Matters from the BBC World Service with me, Jamie Robertson, and also with my guest, Peter Morisi, who's Professor Emeritus of International Business at the R.H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and also financial professional Jessica Kine. We're going away for a couple of minutes. We'll be back in a second.
This is the BBC World Service.
On the hour, every hour. This is the BBC News. We bring you the latest news headlines.
Joe Biden has won the American presidential election.
The people of this nation have spoken.
He will now become the president in January, pending the outcome of any legal challenges.
I'm fascinated that everybody's celebrating, I would argue prematurely.
We believed in our hearts that Biden was best for the United States.
Lots of people here chanting, count the vote, we love Trump.
With further in-depth analysis throughout the day from our presenters and reporters based all around the world.
There will be a huge sigh of relief across Europe. They will want to use this as an opportunity to try to repair some pretty broken transatlantic relationships.
And we tell the stories of the people at the heart of the headlines.
We want peace within this country. We want unity. It's just sad how divided we are, although we're supposed to be the United States of America.
The BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
You're listening to Business Matters from the BBC World Service with me, Jamie Robertson. Coming up in the next half hour, we're going to be looking at the fate of mass transit systems in a world where travelling to work is no longer what you do to get to work. And the times they are a-changing. Bob Dylan sells his entire catalogue to Universal. A sound business move, selling at the top of the market, or the end of an era? That's all after the latest world news.
BBC News with Justine Green. US media say President-elect Joe Biden has chosen the retired Army General Lloyd Austin as his defense secretary. If confirmed, General Austin will be the first African-American to lead the Pentagon. He retired less than 7 years ago and would need a special waiver by Congress. The governors of two of the US biggest states, California and New York, have warned of a worsening public health crisis as hospitals fill up with coronavirus patients. America's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said there were concerns that the middle of January could be a really dark time for the US. Researchers say there's been a huge increase in civilian casualties in Afghanistan since the US military relaxed its rules of engagement for airstrikes targeting the Taliban in 2017. The US study says there was an increase of 330% in the number of civilians killed in airstrikes during that period. The US has added Nigeria to a list of countries for which Washington is especially concerned about threats to religious freedom. The US list also includes China, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea and Saudi Arabia. Israeli ministers have announced a nationwide nighttime curfew starting on Wednesday to try to halt a steep increase in coronavirus cases ahead of one of the main Jewish festivals. Under the curfew, commerce will be prohibited and travel will be restricted. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson say they'll meet in Brussels in the coming days in a last-ditch effort to salvage a post-Brexit trade deal. A British government source said there was every chance no deal would be reached. One of the most notable mountaineers of the 20th century, the British climber Doug Scott, has died aged 79. In 1975, he and a partner were the first to ascend Everest by the southwest face. BBC News.
Hello, welcome back to Business Matters with me, Jamie Robertson, here in the UK, Peter Marisi in Washington, Jessica Kine in Malaysia. Now, how did you get to work today? Did you go to work today? The chances are, whatever you did, you didn't go anywhere by bus, train or tram. Millions are simply no longer using them, either because they have no work to go to, they're working from home, or they're alarmed by the health risk of riding in close proximity to hundreds of strangers. But public transport systems rely on huge volumes of people every day to keep them going financially. In some cities, the pandemic has led to a cash crunch and even government bailouts. Manuela Zaragoza has been looking at the state of public transport.
I took the 645 from Long Island Railroad train this morning and got on the 2 and then the 1 to come down to the office at 2 Broadway, which is where the MTA's headquarters, and I've been doing that throughout the pandemic.
Pat Foy is a lifelong New Yorker. He's also chairman of New York's public transport system, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA. And even the pandemic hasn't stopped his daily commute to work in Manhattan. Mr. Foy's problem is that other commuters in New York haven't been as keen to follow his example. Passenger numbers there on subways and railways are down to just a third of what they used to be. It's so bad that New York's mass transit system is now facing an unprecedented financial crisis. Some even say it's an existential one. The BBC's Michelle Fleury took the subway in New York to see for herself just how quiet it is these days.
It's rush hour and I'm just entering a station just to see what it feels like to ride the MTA in the middle of a pandemic. Got my Metro card, swiping it through the turnstile. So it's 8 in the morning and I can see about a dozen people on the platform, but normally this place would be packed at this time of day. What's it like riding the subway in the middle of a pandemic?
Since March, it's been pretty scary, just not wanting to touch anything.
So what brings you out here today?
I'm an essential worker, so I've had to ride throughout the whole thing.
Keep those around you safe. Stand on the phone wall to stay 6 feet apart. Spread out if 6 feet is not possible. Thank you for keeping your health.
I really don't like it. I have to go to a medical appointment.
So you haven't really been riding the subway unless you absolutely have to?
Yeah.
I would say that I feel pretty safe as long as everybody has a mask and
I know the social distancing is kind of like an impossibility in New York City with so many people, but I'm just doing what I can on my part, making sure I have a mask, and I think as long as everybody else is wearing masks, I think that gives everybody like a sense of comfort riding the trains.
That last commuter might be feeling safe, others aren't, which explains why the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA, has a multi-billion-dollar hole in its budget. Back to Pat Foy.
At the height of the pandemic, subway ridership was down 95%. And even now, subway ridership is down. It varies from day to day, but on a weekday, we're carrying about 30% of pre-pandemic volumes. We get about half our revenues from our customers, fares on subways, buses, the commuter rails, and tolls. We are looking for federal funding of $12 billion to get us through, and these are staggering numbers. If we don't get federal aid, our hand will be forced, and we'll be forced to make service reductions on the subways and buses of 40%. 50% on the commuter rails, and to lay off close to 10,000 of our colleagues. If we don't get federal funding along the lines that I described, our hand may be forced.
But do you accept that there will be people listening who say, well, why should you get this much money? We don't even know if all these commuters who are staying away now, if they'll ever come back, because people are working remotely now, and things may well be different long term after COVID ends.
Well, there's no question that ridership patterns will change to some extent. An emergency room nurse can't work remotely. A utility worker or a transit worker can't work remotely. Around the margins, there will be a reduction in the ridership in the short term, especially on commuter rails. But the trend to urbanization, I think, is a global trend. It's inexorable. It's driven by a number of factors, including talent wanting to accumulate and aggregate together. It's driven by environmental concerns and creative talent issues, and those issues will be with us for a long period of time. Ridership on subways and buses, I believe, will come back, and the MTA, like other agencies, is going to have to evolve.
Pat Foy, chairman of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. It's what happens in the interim that's key here. The Brussels-based International Association of Public Transport reckons EU countries will miss out on 45 billion euros in ticket sales this year. The association's Secretary-General is Mohammed Misghani.
Teleworking or working from home will probably continue. Maybe not at full time, but maybe some days per week, people will work from home. This may have an impact, a long-lasting impact on the ridership of public transport.
Yeah, I suppose your problem here is that you just don't know whether this remote working trend is going to persist or not. So it must be impossible to plan and to know how to adapt services.
Exactly. This will have an impact on mobility in general, not just on public transport. And so we have to adapt the services to this new trends, but we need also to improve the quality of public transport, because people now, they expect public transport to be cleaner, that we have less crowds also. So it's about flattening the peak at the peak hours in the morning, in the evening, to make the travel conditions more comfortable and of better quality.
Mohammed Misghani of the International Association of Public Transport. The not knowing when or if passengers will come back is clearly a big problem. And mass transit systems are turning to central governments and city coffers for financial bailouts in the interim.
I'm Nicole Gelinas, and I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute focused on New York City economics, budget situation, and infrastructure.
Nicole says cities simply have no choice other than to invest in transport if they want to see an economic recovery.
If you do not have millions of people every day flowing freely through the transit system, the city really doesn't work. I mean, if you think about Manhattan's economy below 60th Street, we've got 150,000 jobs per square mile, the greatest concentration of white-collar jobs in the world. If we don't find a way to get these concentrations of people back into Manhattan, very, very difficult to create those jobs environments in the suburbs and in places further away from a dense city.
Do we know what the wider economic effects are of a reduction in mass transit system services?
New York University did a study in the early fall that said, if we make these drastic cuts to the transit system, talking about 40 to 50% cuts in service, we would put up to 425,000 jobs at risk. Some of those jobs are direct transit jobs, people who either work for the transit system or do construction projects for the transit system, building new subway extensions and so forth. But most of those jobs are just people who rely on the transit system. A lot of these jobs will end up being lost. The transit system is kind of the underpinning of what makes the New York region's economy so efficient. I think there will be demand to get back into an office environment. It may look different than it used to, but it will require a functional transit system. And by the way, even if people do work at home more often or they have a home office, people over the past 40 years have gravitated back to cities like New York and London because of the cultural amenities, the parks, the better job opportunities, better opportunities for education. And so even if they work a little bit differently, if they still choose to live in or near an urban environment, they'll still need a transit system just to go to the museum, go see a play, go out to eat, go visit family and friends. New York doesn't do those things inside private cars.
That was Nicole Galinas of the Manhattan Institute, ending that report by Manuela Zaragoza. Just what's it like? We had very much a report there on Europe and the US. In Asia and in Malaysia in particular, what's happened to the public transport systems there?
I think the important fact to bear in mind is that car ownership on this long peninsular nation is roughly about 900 owners out of 1,000 population. So per capita 1,897 car owners, and that is a very old statistic from the ASEAN from 2017. So you don't have that very dense urban sort of mass transit need, apart from in the key capital, KL, which is 330 kilometers to the north from where I am. But somewhere like Singapore, you still have a vital need for mass transit because it is a much smaller physical territory. So I think...
Yeah. So you're investing in a mass transport system across the border, aren't you?
There is the short link between JB and Singapore, although probably completion 2026, Jamie, which is rather far. I think the project size is not that big. It's crucial because currently what's transporting these workers are scooters and motorcycles. So there is
what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Some people see that as being the solution.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's worked for years now and has helped keep up the labour force for Singapore. But I think the issue now is locked borders, yes? These people either had to be quickly housed in temporary housing before the full border lockdowns, or now the only cars and possibly bikes that are getting through are those that have special exemptions, a ton of COVID tests either end, etc., etc. But it's well nigh impossible. I have not physically driven across the causeway into Singapore since February the 7th. And today we are December the 8th. So that shows you how long.
What is the state of that border at the moment then? It just has masses of checks and tests on it, does it, before you can get across the border?
I think for key logistic and supply chains, yes, special, food transport. Singapore relies on Malaysia for a great deal of its food. Self-sufficiency ratio is rather low. So Malaysia is a very, very important neighbouring partner in that sense. But for actual physical traffic, I think you've just had, say if you were a CEO of a company and you could provide an itinerary as to why you needed to cross the causeway, and then you had tests either end, it might work. But for Mr. and Mrs. Normal, no one's been across.
But it's interesting. You seem to think that the solution or the progression, what will happen is they will build more mass transit to be able to bring people across the border. But it seems at the moment the way people are looking forward is that mass transit is not the way to go, because there are not going to be enough people who are going to want to use it in these kind of rather precarious times we live in.
Well, I was going to say, haven't we had the third leg of the stool knocked off in terms of the whole notion of mass transit, very much due to the pure longevity of the life of this vicious virus? The future is imponderable in that sense. We cannot fully assess the ratio of work from home, the ratio of, 2 to 3 days a week in a central or, central business district office. I think there's a huge paradigm shift.
I'm really interested in that. Peter, what do you think about the way in which, cities, particularly modern cities, London in particular, New York in particular, they have been built on mass transit, haven't they, on big public transport systems? And
those transportation systems were built because of the way we worked. Large organizations would occupy whole towers. I remember the Metropolitan Life Building, floor after floor of people who can now be connected by the internet. And what the virus did, like wars do, is it caused an acceleration of technological change. The experts that you interviewed were all looking at the city as if it would just come back to the way it was in the past. And it's not going to. It's going to change.
What are you going to... All right, so, okay, Peter, so what are you going to do with all those subways? What are you going to do with all those buses? You're going to turn them into museums or drains or sewage systems? What are you going to do?
Well, the New York City subway system is a special case because it's not up to the standards of advanced countries. It's in terrible need of repair. But you can run that system on fewer trains with fewer people. They're terribly crowded now and overtaxed, and we haven't been able to build new lines. I'm a native New Yorker, as you know.
But actually, that's a really interesting... But Peter, that's a really interesting point. The problem about public transport systems... Once you start to reduce the amount of trains that run on it, say, or trams that run on it, or whatever, it becomes less attractive, less useful to the people who want to use it.
Actually,
and so
not.
It becomes used less.
I disagree with that.
You saw that very much with buses in this country. It happened with that. You run them less and less, people use them less and less, and eventually you get rid of them.
New York City transit system and even the Washington transit system during the commuter hours are so grossly overpacked and crowded. That's one of the reasons people don't want to go back to their offices. The system is overused, not in normal times. What's going to happen? We're not going to have the same density of jobs per square mile, and a lot of those office towers are going to be reverted to apartment buildings. They're going to be converted. In fact, people are already looking at that option of converting some of the office towers into places for people to live. My feeling is that work will be more spread out. People will go to the office less often. They will continue to go because employers will want to amalgamate their people for creativity purposes, but they don't have to be there 50 hours a week. So my feeling is that people are looking at this through the lens of the past and not exercising enough imagination because they're in a crisis and they want to find some way of restoring normal.
Okay, quick last word.
That's the proper thing to do.
A last word from Jessica. Do you think it's going to change the way that cities exist in Asia? Do you think that it's going to the attitude towards public transport and the way we move around will actually change cities themselves, or do you think it will actually go back to what it was?
I'm slightly in the camp with Peter that we're not going to go back to the old normal. I think there will be a new normal, and that will also have a tremendous domino effect on property prices. So he talked about how all these MetLife Tower buildings might be converted into apartments, etc. I think most people with the work from home thinking are now also thinking, okay, I don't want to be in a small apartment. I'd like a little house with a garden, a bit of greenery, a bit of fresh air, and I've got the technology to do my job from home. So there will be a very, very huge shift in property.
Time to listen to a bit of Bob Dylan, I think, because as you may have heard in the news, the American singer-songwriter has sold the rights to his entire back catalogue, about 600 tracks. Sold them to Universal Music Group, UMG. The deal is one of the biggest in Universal's history, means the company will collect all future income from these songs. Includes both the income Dylan currently receives as a songwriter and his control of each song's copyright.
Gather round,
you must know what that's called. Bob Dylan performing The Times They Are A-Changing. I'm not quite sure which concert he was at, but anyway, probably an appropriate tune to play on such a day. Duncan Bartlett is a writer and a broadcaster. He's followed Dylan's career closely since 1980 and seen him in concert on dozens of occasions. I interviewed him, apparently, he told me, surrounded by vinyl copies of hundreds of his songs. And I asked him what had prompted Universal to buy the Dylan back catalogue.
Well, at the moment, music publishing is in a massive boom. So there have been lots of hedge funds that have started to come in, and this is all buoyed by the surge in streaming. Bob Dylan's been making records on vinyl for more than 50 years, but now this is a bit of a boom time in terms of music publishing, and Universal are the experts here. There's a lot of money involved. We don't know the exact figure, but the New York Times is suggesting something like $300 million US. So my understanding is that what's being sold here is the publishing company. Bob Dylan has owned his own publishing company since 1964. And as a result of that, he gets a slice of both the publishing and the songwriter section of the royalties every time somebody buys one of his songs or indeed streams it. So this is the publishing part of the Bob's rights, which have been passed over to Universal.
Any idea what kind of return they're going to get on it? I mean, if they're investing, let's say, for the sake of argument, $300 million, what are they going to get? Better than putting their money in a bank account.
Well, I don't know how they've calculated the future income. It's easier to see it from Dylan's point of view. He's not going to be able to earn another $300 million from his own publishing rights during his lifetime. So what he's really thinking about is